I froze when I heard my wife say, "I'm single," to her boss at the company couples dinner, and it wasn't just the cold of the air conditioning that cut through my spine that night. It was the shock, the dry lump in my throat, the sudden absence of ground beneath my feet. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something strange from her, but it was the first time I'd heard such a devastating sentence, delivered with a slight, almost seductive smile, as if she weren't carrying the weight of a ring on her left hand and the story of a marriage that, until that moment, I'd believed to be real. And as she smiled, I trembled. Not with anger, but with disbelief. I shouldn't have been there. She said it was a small, informal event, just for close colleagues. It was one of those nights when I felt I could trust her completely, as I always had. But something pulled me to that restaurant. A strange discomfort, an instinct, or maybe my heart trying to warn me before it was too late. I entered through the back, as if invading my own life, and found her there, her back straight, laughing at some random comment, and saying in a firm voice, as if she'd practiced that phrase many times, "I'm single." I froze. Not because I didn't know what it meant. But because, in that moment, everything we'd built lost its meaning. I didn't scream. I didn't make a fuss. I just walked up to her, my chest wrenching, the pain shooting up my ribs like fire, and said softly, close enough for her to feel the ice in my voice, "Now you're really single, because I want a divorce." She froze. Not in surprise, but in panic. She hadn't expected me to be there. And maybe, deep down, she hadn't expected me to have the courage to leave. But I did. I went home like someone leaving a battlefield, knowing they'd left their heart shattered to pieces. I slept on the couch, if you can call that torment in which your mind replays everything 100 times, every detail, every laugh, every gesture she made at that table, sleep. I wondered when she'd lost herself. Or when I'd become invisible. Worst of all was knowing I still loved her. Even with the betrayal throbbing inside me, even with the bitter taste of humiliation burning in my throat, I still missed her touch, her smell in the morning, the silly jokes she'd tell that made me smile. But I signed the papers. Not out of hatred. But out of dignity. Because I didn't deserve to share my life with someone who lied about me so naturally. She tried, of course. She tried to justify it, saying it was a tossed-up phrase, a misunderstanding, a silly joke. She tried to remind me of the good times, tried to restore our history as if it were a broken vase that could be glued back together with tears. But there was no glue left. There was no trust left. And when there's no trust, love becomes a memory, and nothing more. I moved on with my life. I left our apartment, moved to another city, and started from scratch. And although I carried the pain of everything that had been destroyed, I also carried with me the certainty that I deserved something more. Something sincere. Something light. I learned to breathe again. I met new people. I encountered looks that didn't make me doubt myself, words that held no ulterior motives. And one day, quite by accident, I met someone who looked at me as if I were whole, even with all my scars. She, on the other hand, stayed. Surrounded by friends who faded over time, relationships that never deepened, conversations that began with enthusiasm and ended in silence. And when she realized she had traded true love for a fantasy of freedom, it was too late. She returned. She returned as if carrying guilt in her hands and regret in her eyes. She sought me out on a gray afternoon, her voice broken and her eyes moist. She told me she still loved me, that she should never have let me go, that she now understood the value of the peace we had, of the partnership, of the respect. I forgave her. But there was no feeling left. Not anymore. Only compassion remained, a silent sadness for someone who had been so deeply deceived. I looked at her with the serenity of someone who no longer feels pain, only pity. Because she hadn't lost a man. She'd lost the one man who would have done everything for her. I smiled, held her hand for a moment, and wished she would one day find what she'd thrown away. But not with me anymore. And as she crumbled in front of me, grasping the weight of her choice, I walked down the aisle with another woman. A woman who never needed to say she was committed, because every gesture she made spoke volumes. And there, in that moment, she understood, cruelly and definitively, that the love of her life had already found another place to blossom. But the most curious thing of all wasn't the betrayal, nor the regret, nor the new love. The most curious thing was what she discovered years later, by chance, when she thought she'd gotten over it all, something that would completely change the way she viewed that night at dinner. Something she never expected. Something that might explain why I'd actually shown up there. Something that, she might never forget. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, and never will support, any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry a brutal truth: betrayal destroys. It destroys homes, hearts, trust, and futures. Our goal is clear: to show the real consequences of bad choices and make you reflect deeply on the value of true love. Brace yourself. What you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a reality check. Daniel and Claire met on an autumn evening, one of those when the wind is still warm but already holds the promise of change. Their encounter happened by chance, in a small coffee shop downtown, as they both sought shelter from the sudden downpour that surprised them on the street. He was reading a book with his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, she was talking on the phone while balancing a wet umbrella between her legs. A request exchanged with the waitress was the beginning of a brief conversation that ended up stretching on for hours. From that point on, everything seemed to unfold naturally, as if it had already been written somewhere. It wasn't a romance that began with overwhelming passion, but calmly, with light laughter and glances that gradually revealed each other, like someone opening an old letter, word by word, until they know the whole story. Daniel had always been a calm man, with firm gestures and a quiet voice. He worked as a financial analyst at a stable company and led a predictable but comfortable life. He didn't have great material ambitions, but he carried within him a sincere desire to build something lasting with someone who shared his values. What he valued most was truth, the silent truth, the kind that doesn't shout, but is proven in everyday life. Claire, on the other hand, was more impulsive, more alive to the details. A literature teacher, passionate about poetry and the intensity she saw in words, her eyes carried the restlessness typical of someone who wants to feel everything, live everything, to the brim. She was extroverted, elegant, self-assured, but possessed a hidden tenderness few knew, and it was precisely this layer of restrained sweetness that captured Daniel's heart. The beginning of their life together was as one usually dreams: spontaneous trips, Sunday lunches at their parents' house, dinners cooked together with music playing in the background and laughter filling the living room. They lived in a modest apartment decorated with Claire's paintings and the plants Daniel insisted on watering even when she forgot. They shared their days with a lightness only newlyweds possess, as if the world outside grew smaller every time the door closed behind them. Every detail of their routine seemed to confirm what they both already knew, that they were where they were supposed to be. There were no excessive promises, no empty vows. There was presence, care, reciprocity. Friends said they were the kind of couple that inspired. Always together at events, birthdays, and get-togethers. Claire was the one who talked to everyone, circulating among the tables with a glass in her hand and a joke on the tip of her tongue. Daniel was the one who listened, observed, and responded with a sincere laugh and a pointed comment, always by her side, his hand resting discreetly on her back. They weren't perfect, of course. They argued about schedules, unexpected visits from their mother-in-law, and bills that sometimes piled up more than expected. But even in tense moments, they maintained respect. They never went to bed angry, never went to bed without a goodnight kiss. Over time, stability began to settle in more definitively. They bought a larger apartment, began planning their first child, and renovated the room that had previously been a small office into a future nursery. Daniel grew within the company, took on new projects, and began traveling more frequently for work. Claire dedicated herself to graduate school, expanded her teaching career, was invited to speak at conferences, and became involved in cultural projects. They were proud of each other, and it was evident. They spoke of each other with a twinkle in their eyes, as if carrying an extension of their own dreams in their partner. When they were together, there was still a close bond, but not for as long. And it was precisely then that, without realizing it, they began to leave small gaps between them. The messages became shorter. The calls became more spaced out. The good morning kisses became quick, hurried. When Daniel returned from a trip, he'd find Claire asleep on the couch, books scattered about and a half-empty glass of wine. When she woke early to review her classes, he was still in the room, asleep after nights of meetings. They both said it was a phase. That it was normal. That the love was still there, even if buried under the rush of everyday life. And indeed, there was love. But love alone is sometimes not enough. Even with the subtle disagreements, they both made an effort. The short weekend trips, the mid-afternoon coffees, the notes left on the mirror. Daniel surprised her with flowers for no reason, Claire prepared his favorite dishes on random occasions. There was mutual effort, and this was evident to those who knew them closely. But something deep down had changed. Perhaps not the feeling, but the way each of them carried it. Claire began to feel restless, as if being swallowed by the routine she had so avoided. Teaching, once a vibrant passion, seemed like a tireless repetition. Conversations with Daniel, once full of life, became more practical, almost administrative. He, in turn, sensed the distance in her eyes, but preferred to believe it was just fatigue. He tried to fill the gaps with more work, more stability, more structure. He thought that would be enough. It was during this period that Claire began to move closer to new social circles. She attended events, conferences, and book launches. She began going out alone more often, saying she needed time for herself, that it was healthy, that it was important to maintain her individuality. And he agreed. He had always trusted her. There was no reason to doubt her. Not until then. When she arrived late, she said she'd overslept. When she forgot to respond to messages, she justified it by saying she was too busy. Daniel accepted everything with the serenity of someone who prefers to maintain peace rather than question what they don't want to hear. And Claire, even feeling slightly uncomfortable with her own absence, continued to follow the new rhythm, as if trying to rediscover herself within her own life. The families remained close. To outsiders, they were a stable, functional, loving couple. They shared moments with their parents, nephews, and old colleagues. They posted photos of trips, smiles at parties, and affectionate messages on social media. The appearance was harmonious. But inside the house, conversations became shorter. Silences longer. Hugs more rare. There was affection, but no longer any urgency. There was a memory of what they had been, but not the same flame that had united them. Daniel sometimes tried to rekindle something. He organized special nights, suggested trips, talked about starting new plans. Claire responded with a gentle smile, but always seemed a bit distant, as if she were only half-heartedly present. There were no serious fights. No insults, no shouting, no meltdowns. And perhaps that was the most dangerous part. Because what separated them wasn't the chaos, it was the silence. It wasn't the glaring mistakes, but the absence of small gestures that had once been natural. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both felt something slipping through their fingers. Daniel still believed everything could work out. That it was just a curve in the road. Claire, for her part, tried to convince herself it was just a phase of rediscovery. But there was a void slowly forming, and neither of them knew exactly how to fill it. The routine continued. The wedding continued. Life continued. And it was in this apparent calm that the story began to change. Because sometimes, it's in the silence of ordinary days that the most dangerous decisions are hidden. And neither Daniel nor Claire knew it yet, but something much bigger than they imagined was about to happen. Something that would forever change everything they knew as love, as loyalty, as truth. And when the truth finally came out, neither would be prepared to deal with the consequences. The following months seemed to fly by without Daniel noticing. He was immersed in the company's new project, dealing with tight deadlines, endless meetings, and constant travel. The pressure was intense, but he felt motivated, as if this new challenge offered an opportunity to renew something within himself that had been wearing thin. He tried, whenever possible, to maintain a vibrant presence at home, even from a distance. He sent morning messages, photos of the cities he'd visited, short audio recordings describing his day. He wanted, somehow, to remain present in Claire's life even on days when his body was away. And, in a way, he believed it was still possible. Physical absence, he thought, would never be as damaging as emotional absence, and he refused to allow that. Claire, for her part, was increasingly immersed in a routine that blended academic commitments, cultural events, and social gatherings. The energy with which she dedicated herself to outside activities was evident, to her presence in environments where she was recognized, where she was praised, where she received glances that seemed to rekindle something within her. Sometimes she would look in the mirror before going out and smile almost childishly, as if experiencing a new version of herself. She took pleasure in choosing dresses, in painting her lips red, in knowing she was attracting attention. She no longer informed Daniel as often about where she was going, and when he called, he would casually say he was in a meeting or that his phone was on silent. He responded late, but always with loving messages. Nothing that aroused suspicion. Nothing that directly compromised her. She still slept next to him, still smiled at Sunday breakfasts, still posted photos with him when they went to visit their parents. But something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. There was one particular night, among so many ordinary ones, that marked the beginning of a definitive separation. Daniel had returned from his trip earlier than expected, wanting to surprise her. He stopped by the florist, picked out the yellow tulips she loved so much, bought a bottle of their favorite wine, and arrived home with a rare enthusiasm. It was the anniversary of their first kiss, a date Claire often remembered fondly. When she walked in, the house was empty. There was no note, no message, no sign that she was nearby. She called, and the call went straight to voicemail. She waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. At midnight, she sat on the couch, the bottle still unopened beside her, and let the silence fill the room. When Claire arrived, around 1 a.m., she simply said she'd lost track of time at a cocktail party with college friends. She smiled, taking off her shoes in the hallway, and kissed him on the forehead as if nothing were wrong. Daniel said nothing. He just smiled back and went to sleep, but that night, he couldn't close his eyes. From that day on, he began to observe. Not with suspicion, but with attention. He began to notice the small gestures, the averted glances, the more frequent cell phone taps. He noticed that Claire smiled less when they were alone and more when reading messages. That she took longer in the shower, that she perfumed herself even on afternoons without commitments. He tried, in an almost desperate effort, to rekindle the flame. He planned a romantic trip, wrote letters, reminisced about memorable moments. She accepted everything sweetly, gratefully, affectionately, but without surrender. Daniel felt like he was trying to hold water in his hands. Everything was slipping through his fingers, and he no longer knew how to contain it. One afternoon, after returning from work early, he walked home and heard muffled laughter coming from Claire's office. The door was ajar. He approached silently. On the other end, she was talking on the phone, her voice soft, whispered, intimate. She was laughing at something the other person was saying. She used words he hadn't heard in a long time. When she noticed his presence, she became startled, ended the call abruptly, and disguised herself. She said she was a friend, that they were scheduling a study group meeting. Daniel didn't question her. He simply nodded and said he was going to take a shower. But in that moment, a piercing certainty formed within him. He didn't need proof, nor confrontation. He knew. He just didn't know how to react. In the following days, he maintained the same attitude. His tone didn't change, nor his habits. He continued taking care of the house, making dinner, asking how her day was. But internally, he was fighting a cruel battle between the urge to confront and the fear of the answer. A part of you still wanted to believe you could save what they were losing. That all it took was an honest conversation, a genuine gesture, a fresh start. But there was another part, more tired, more lucid, that was beginning to accept that perhaps Claire had already made her choice. The company dinner was approaching. A traditional event where employees brought their partners and celebrated the year's results. Claire spoke about it enthusiastically, as if it were an important event, as if she were looking forward to it. But she didn't mention Daniel's presence at any point. He silently decided not to say he would be attending. He bought a new suit, confirmed his attendance on his own, and waited for the right moment. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. But out of a deep need to look into her eyes and understand what had been lost. On the night of the event, he arrived discreetly. He walked past the guests, past the artificial smiles, past the toasts and introductions. When he saw her, something inside him stopped. Claire was stunning, deep in conversation with a man he didn't know. She laughed in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. She touched his arm naturally. When one of her colleagues commented that he didn't know she was single, Claire responded with a slight smile, as if signing a sentence. She said yes. That she was single. Daniel felt a sudden chill run through his chest. It was no longer doubt. It was the cruel confirmation of everything he had been denying to himself. He walked toward her, unhurriedly, without making a fuss. She saw him approach, and her expression changed. She tried to hide it, tried to smile, tried to appear natural. But he approached and said, with terrifying calm, the words that would end that cycle, "Now you're truly single, because I want a divorce." The room fell silent for a few seconds. She didn't know what to say. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, her mouth hanging open. He turned his back and left. There was nothing more to say. Inside the car, with her hands on the steering wheel, she felt the weight of the world fall upon her. But for the first time in a long time, she also felt something she hadn't experienced in months: freedom. There were no more lies. There were no more pretenses. And the next day, when she woke up, she knew her life would start from scratch. But there was something Claire didn't know yet. Something she would soon discover. Something that would completely change the way she remembered that night. Because there was a detail in that story she could never have predicted. And that detail, when it came to light, would leave scars that no amount of time could erase. Claire spent the days following the dinner like someone walking through a field of ruins. She didn't cry in front of anyone, but her soul bled inside. She avoided telling her closest friends what really happened, saying it was a misunderstanding, that Daniel was stressed, that everything would be resolved soon. But when she lay in bed alone, with her pillow soaked and the silence filling the room that had once been filled with his calm breathing, it was impossible to deny, the love she once had, she had crushed with her own hands. She tried to convince herself it was just a slip-up, that neediness, that feeling of emptiness, of abandonment, of being invisible within the marriage, were justifications for everything. But there was something in Daniel's posture, something in the firmness with which he left her life, that showed otherwise. It wasn't just a momentary decision. It was a conscious goodbye. And that tore her apart more than any scream. She tried calling. Several times. He didn't answer. She sent long, sincere, painful messages. No response. She mailed a handwritten letter, expressing all her remorse, all her shame, all her longing. There was no response. Mutual friends already knew about the divorce, but avoided taking sides. Some said Daniel was quieter than usual, that he seemed determined but with heavy eyes. Others said he threw himself into work as a way to avoid thinking. Some even said he was already seeing someone else. Claire refused to believe it. But even if it were true, she couldn't judge. She had worked it out with her own decisions. It was late on a cloudy afternoon, weeks later, that Claire decided to go to him. She needed to talk, needed to explain, needed to at least see him. She found him in a discreet cafe, where they knew he often stopped by to read, away from the eyes of his acquaintances. When she entered, she saw him sitting by the window, a book in his hands and a neutral expression. Her heart raced. She felt like running to him, hugging him, and begging for forgiveness with her whole body. But she restrained herself. She approached slowly and excused herself. He looked up, saw her, didn't smile, but didn't push her away either. He simply closed his book and gestured for her to sit down. The first few minutes were silent. She trembled, and he kept his gaze serene, as if he'd already accepted everything. She apologized, told him how lost she felt, how she hadn't expected this to happen, how she even missed the smell of his shirt hanging on the clothesline. She said it hadn't been for lack of love, but cowardice, insecurity, a foolish yearning to feel alive again. She spoke without pause, her voice broken, tears streaming shamelessly. When he finished, he remained silent for a while, looking at her as if listening to the past being recounted, but from a distant place. Daniel took a deep breath and said he didn't hate her. That he didn't wish her harm. That he understood the holes time leaves in a relationship. He said he too had flaws, too had been absent, too had failed to notice the signs. But that betrayal was a line that couldn't be crossed. That no matter how much she regretted it, there was something that, once broken, could never be rebuilt the same way. Claire listened to him with tears streaming down her face. She said she accepted the pain, but that she wanted, at least, a chance to show her that it was still possible to start over. And it was at that moment that Daniel lowered his gaze, rested his hands on the table, and revealed what she never expected to hear. He explained, in a low voice, that he'd been at the dinner by chance. That he hadn't been invited. He said he only found out about the event because, that very morning, he'd received an unexpected call from someone she knew well. A woman Claire would never have imagined involved. A woman who had been a part of her life long before Daniel showed up. The former college roommate she'd shared an apartment with for 2 years, who was the bridesmaid at their wedding, and with whom she'd broken ties after a minor argument. This woman had met Daniel by coincidence at a lecture he'd given on finance. They talked, laughed, and reminisced about old stories. She asked about Claire, and he spoke naturally, still believing their marriage was solid. The woman, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated, but then said something that changed everything. She told him she'd seen Claire, weeks earlier, in a restaurant, kissing another man. That wasn't gossip. It was true. She said she recognized the man too. He was Claire's boss. She said she didn't know if he knew about it, but that she thought it was only fair that he should. Claire interrupted him, shocked. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to say it was an exaggeration. But he looked at her with frightening calm and said he was already sure. That he didn't need confirmation. That the connection had only prepared him. He pushed him to the restaurant, where he heard from her own mouth, in front of everyone, that she was single. Claire was crying harder now. She said she didn't know the woman had seen them, that it was a mistake, that she didn't want to hurt him. But Daniel kept his voice firm. And then he revealed the part that would crush her. He said that same night he received the call, while he was still processing everything, he called Claire's father. Not to gossip. But because he needed to understand. He wanted to hear from someone who knew her deeply if she was unhappy, if she was giving him signs he'd ignored. He wanted to know if there was still something there that could be saved. And her father, in a tough and sincere conversation, said something he'd never forgotten: if you still love her, go there, but be ready to leave her. Because my daughter, she doesn't know what she has. And maybe she needs to lose it to understand. It was that sentence that brought him to dinner. Claire stared at him as if she were being suffocated inside. She asked why he never told her any of this before. Why he didn't confront her. Why you didn't scream. Daniel responded with a sigh and said that, at that moment, he realized he no longer needed to fight. That there was no point in confrontation when the truth had already been exposed so clearly. And then, holding her gaze, he added, "The worst part, Claire, wasn't seeing you lie. It was realizing that, while I still thought we had time, you were already gone." She tried to touch him. She said she missed him, that she loved him. But he gently pushed her hand away. He said he forgave her. But the feeling was gone. That her love had come too late. And now he was moving on. Claire asked if there was anyone. He hesitated. But with a slight smile, he said yes. That he was meeting someone. That it was recent, but slight. That he didn't know where it would lead, but that, for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Claire recoiled as if struck in the stomach. Not out of jealousy. But because she understood, once and for all, what she had lost. Daniel stood, left the money for the coffee, and said goodbye with one last serene look. Claire sat there amidst the hubbub of the place, her heart aching. There was nothing left to do. There was no going back. The truth had been revealed. But what she didn't know was that there was even more. One last piece to the puzzle. Something she would discover very soon, and that would transform the regret she felt into something even deeper, crueler, more definitive. Claire didn't go straight home that afternoon. She walked the streets as if searching for something she knows she won't find. The sky was gray, the wind bit her skin, and cars hurried past as if unaware of the silent collapse happening inside her. She entered a park she used to frequent with Daniel in the early years of their marriage, sat on a bench soaked in the drizzle, and let the cold seep into her bones. She ran her hands hard over her face, trying to stay awake, trying to understand how she'd gotten here. The pain she felt wasn't just loss. It was shame, humiliation, a belated lucidity that now hurt more than any external judgment. She never thought Daniel would be capable of leaving. She never imagined he would be able to walk away so firmly. And now, more than that, he was moving on. With someone else. With another story. With another life. And this, as much as it hurt, was deserved. In the days that followed, Claire sank into a state of profound introspection. She cancelled appointments, declined invitations, and avoided any contact except absolutely necessary. There was no longer any way to sustain the act he'd put on for so long. He stared at his own reflection with contempt and walked the hallways of the apartment with shuffling steps, as if the now empty place were in mourning. She began writing long texts that she never sent, letters that had no recipient. She began visiting her parents more frequently, but avoided talking about Daniel. Her mother tried to console her, her father was completely silent. But one Sunday, he asked to speak to his daughter alone and, with a firm look in his eyes, said what she most dreaded hearing: "You lost the only person who knew you completely and yet chose to love you every day. You don't meet that twice." Claire lowered her eyes, as if hearing a sentence she already knew. That night, she slept with the feeling that she had become a stranger in her own life. Meanwhile, Daniel was reconfiguring his routine with serenity. It wasn't an expansive happiness, but a new calm, like someone finally finding peace after a silent war. The woman he was beginning to date, Isabella, had a different way of being than anything he'd ever experienced. She didn't burden him with demands, nor did she try to invade his silences. She listened to him with genuine attention, spoke gently, and acted with presence. She was the kind of person who asked simple questions, but with a gaze that excavated layers. He felt he could be himself with her, effortlessly. It wasn't love yet, but it was the beginning. It was true. And that was enough. The connection between them grew naturally. Simple dinners, nighttime walks, late-night conversations. Isabella knew about his past, knew about Claire, and respected his time. She didn't rush anything, simply offering the possibility of something new. And, little by little, Daniel began to smile again, to sleep peacefully, to make plans. It was then, weeks later, on a rainy afternoon, that Claire decided to drive past the old house where they had lived together. The street was deserted, the trees swayed in the wind, and the gate was now painted a different color. He stopped across the street, watching. A car pulled into the driveway, and Daniel emerged, accompanied by a companion. He opened the trunk, grabbed bags, and laughed at something Isabella said. Claire couldn't hear, but she saw their gestures, their lightness. For a moment, she didn't recognize the man in front of her. He seemed more relaxed, more present, more in control of himself. That hurt more than anything else. He returned home with a bitter taste in his mouth, a kind of regret that burned like acid. Not because he was with someone else, but because she finally understood that the love she had destroyed was rare and irreversible. The next morning, Claire received a message from her old college friend, the same one who had warned Daniel. It was short, direct, asking to talk. The meeting took place at a discreet cafe. The woman arrived seriously, sat across from her, and said she needed to be honest. She explained that she hadn't sought Daniel out of spite, but out of respect. She said she'd always seen Claire as someone special, but that over the years, she'd come to see a veiled arrogance in her choices. That the betrayal wasn't the only mistake, but rather a silent disrespect, selfishness disguised as independence. Claire, disconcerted, tried to interrupt, but the woman continued. And then came the final blow. She revealed that, months before the betrayal, Daniel had asked for advice on how to rekindle their relationship. That he wanted to surprise Claire. That he wanted to take her on a special trip. And it was she, the friend, who helped him organize everything. They chose the destination together, made reservations, he even handwrote a letter to deliver during the trip. All this days before discovering the betrayal. Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. Each word was a knife. Her friend then pulled a battered envelope from her bag and handed it to her. It was the letter. The one Daniel never had time to deliver. Claire opened it, hands trembling. His handwriting was firm. The content, devastating. He spoke of gratitude, of love, of a desire to start over. He said that, even with the distance he felt, he believed it was worth trying again. That he wanted to listen, understand, rebuild. That she was, for him, more than a choice, she was destiny. Claire didn't cry. He was in shock. He closed his eyes and remembered everything he'd done in those days. The ignored messages, the secret meetings, the flimsy excuses. The letter was there, like a mirror of what she destroyed before she even realized it. He staggered out of the cafe. The world was spinning. His head was pounding. Guilt was no longer a shadow, but a concrete, overwhelming presence. He walked aimlessly until he reached the riverbank that ran through the city. He sat down, staring into the dark water. He wanted to scream, but there was no one else to hear. That night, he wrote another letter. This time to Daniel. Not with the hope of winning him back, but with the need to acknowledge. She asked for forgiveness, not just for the betrayal, but for being blind to someone who did everything he could to keep her close. She said she now understood that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a daily choice. And that she had failed. She asked him to forgive her for everything, but above all for not being able to see him. The letter never received a reply. But one day, weeks later, Claire saw it in his hands during a publishing house fundraiser where she was also a guest. He read it there, sitting in the shade of a tree, while Isabella chatted with the organizers. When he finished, he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He didn't look for Claire. He didn't say anything. He simply looked at her from afar, with a look that no longer held pain or anger. Only the serene silence of someone who no longer expected anything. Claire understood in that instant that she had been heard. And that this was the end. The true end. But before leaving, as she passed the event reception, Claire heard something that would make her world spin again. Two women were talking nearby. One of them, the event organizer, was talking about the engagement ceremony that would take place the following weekend. She said the couple seemed in love, that he had prepared a beautiful surprise for the bride. Claire stopped. The name he said next confirmed everything. It was Daniel. The woman he was with, was Isabella. They were going to get engaged. She didn't have the strength to keep walking. She leaned against the wall, her eyes fixed on the ground. And for the first time since, she felt not just regret, but something even deeper, a complete lack of hope. She understood, once and for all, that there was no turning back, no crumb, no possibility. That the story between her and Daniel was over. And that the final chapter would not be written by her own hands. The pain was immense, but now it was accompanied by a bitter acceptance. What she had let slip was transforming, right there before her eyes, into a new beginning for him, a beginning in which she would have no place. Claire left the event feeling like she was carrying the weight of a lifetime on her shoulders. The elegant dress she was wearing no longer matched her inner feelings, and each step toward the car seemed to be driven by the pain and regret that had now firmly settled into her consciousness. The parking lot was silent, damp from the drizzle that had begun to fall, as if the weather itself had decided to mourn along with her. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the car, just gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if it were the only anchor remaining between her and the abyss of guilt. His name still echoed in her mind, mixed with Isabella's smile, the laughter she heard in the distance, the carefully folded envelope tucked away in her pocket like a memento that no longer belonged to her. They were engaged. And she, finally, was a page turned. In the days that followed, Claire no longer cried. The tears had dried not for lack of pain, but because her suffering had reached a new stage, that of forced acceptance. She spent her days at home, secluded, as if trying to absorb every layer of everything she had lost. The walls seemed narrower, the hanging pictures no longer made sense, the books that once distracted her now became silent companions of a loneliness that knew no end. She tried to return to her routine, resume her career, fill her time with work. But nothing truly filled her. It was like living alongside a constant absence, a living reminder of what she herself had destroyed with choices that, at the time, seemed small, but now proved irreversible. One Saturday afternoon, while sorting through some boxes in the closet, she found an old notebook where Daniel used to jot down short phrases, excerpts from books, thoughts he wanted to keep. He leafed through it with trembling hands, and there, among so many notes, was a phrase, strongly underlined, "True love demands presence. And if you are not whole, you will be absent, even by their side." Claire felt as if she had been punched in the chest. That sentence, written with such lucidity, summed up exactly the mistake she had made. She had betrayed not only with her body, but with her absence, with her selfishness, with the repeated choice to look at herself when she should have looked at them both. She closed the notebook slowly, as if sealing something she could never rewrite. On the other hand, Daniel was experiencing a completely different process. After his engagement to Isabella, his life seemed to take on a new rhythm. It was a fresh start, free from the weight of the past, free from the expectations that had crushed him for so long. Isabella was different. She didn't make excessive promises, didn't demand perfection, simply walked beside him with ease and truth. The relationship grew slowly, based on listening, respect, and complicity. The shared moments didn't need to be grandiose, comfortable silence, a subtle touch, and shared laughter after a long day were enough. For the first time, Daniel felt he was experiencing something without ghosts, without open scars. There was love, but a calm, mature love, born from small daily sacrifices. Still, there were days when the past knocked on his door. Not as regret, but as a reminder of who he was, what he'd experienced, and how he got there. He passed places they'd once shared, and sometimes he'd feel a slight pang in his chest. But it no longer hurt. It was just a memory. Like a scar that, when touched, still feels tender but no longer bleeds. Daniel knew Claire loved him. And he also knew that, somewhere along the line, she'd lost herself to him. And he tried to rescue her, tried to reach out. But he understood, belatedly, that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. While he built this new life, Claire was experiencing a profound internal conflict. She had understood her mistake, had taken responsibility, but now she faced the cruelest dilemma: how to live with a guilt that would not be erased, even with time. Because time, while it can ease the pain, does not rewrite history. She tried to rebuild herself, to regain joy, to invest in new projects, to reconnect with friendships she had left behind. But everything seemed superficial. No smile was complete, no achievement complete. It was as if something was always missing. And that something, she knew, was the absence of the person who had once been her home. It was on a sunny Sunday that Claire, for the first time since her divorce, decided to visit a place they used to frequent, a park with a small lake, where they picnicked and read books stretched out on the grass. She arrived early, bringing a bottle of wine and a random book, more out of nostalgia than any real desire to read. He sat in the shade of a tree and, for a moment, allowed himself to close his eyes and remember. He smelled the old afternoons, mentally heard the laughter, the sound of the guitar Daniel sometimes carried. It was a sweet but painful memory. Because she knew those times would never return. That the woman he loved was no longer her. And that now, perhaps, he was happier than he had ever been. The following week, she received an unexpected call. It was from Daniel's sister. The two had always been close, even after the divorce, but they hadn't spoken in months. The voice on the other end was calm but direct. She said she thought it was important for Claire to know something. Daniel was moving. He and Isabella were going to live abroad. A professional opportunity had arisen for him, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning far from everything they had experienced there. Claire thanked him for the call, but as soon as she hung up, the world seemed to spin. Until that moment, even without realizing it, she had carried a silent hope that one day they might meet again, perhaps forgive each other more deeply, perhaps even rebuild some connection. But now, that possibility was also fading. In the following days, Claire began walking every day, as if trying to reorganize her thoughts with long strides. It was a solitary but necessary ritual. She reflected on the paths she'd chosen, the words she hadn't said, the actions she should have taken. And, most importantly, on how to rebuild herself now that everything solid had turned to dust. It was a slow, arduous, but honest process. She began therapy, resumed her writing habit, and enrolled in a course she'd always put off out of fear. These were small steps, but they represented something bigger, a genuine attempt to become a better person, even if it was too late for her. Daniel, for his part, continued his journey serenely. Life with Isabella was peaceful, full of plans, but unhurried. They were organizing the move, saying goodbye to friends, selling the apartment. In the final weeks before the trip, he passed by significant places, not as a melancholic farewell, but as a closing of a cycle. He stopped in front of Claire's parents' house and left a letter thanking them for their welcome over so many years. He passed by the old bookstore where he had met her and bought a new copy of the same book he had been reading that day. And finally, he walked to the park where they used to go, sat alone, and simply watched the sunset. He felt at peace. Claire, upon learning of his final departure, wrote a final letter. Not to deliver, but to herself. A letter of forgiveness. She acknowledged her mistakes, thanked him for the love she once had, and, for the first time, forgave herself. Not because she deserved to forget, but because she knew that carrying that pain forever would only prevent her from growing. She tucked the letter away in the back of her drawer, like a full stop written with tears and courage. And then, that night, he slept peacefully. For the first time since everything, he slept with a light heart. Because now I knew that loving was also accepting. And that accepting, often, was letting go. That autumn morning, the sky dawned clear, with a golden light streaming through Claire's windows as if the universe, for a moment, decided to offer her a respite. She woke earlier than usual, without an alarm, without any urgency. She rose with a strange serenity she couldn't quite pinpoint. The silence in the house no longer suffocated her as before, but it still hurt. It was a different silence now, charged not with absence, but with acceptance. She walked to the kitchen, made a strong coffee, the same one Daniel liked, and sat by the window. She watched the movement on the street like someone watching a movie she no longer starred in. Life went on outside, cars passed, children went to school, people hurried about their routines, while inside her, remnants of a time that would never return still lingered. But there was also something new forming, something small, but finally propelling her to look forward without destroying herself with memories. A few days had passed since Daniel's sister called. She still couldn't fully accept that he was leaving for another country, but she had stopped fighting it. The change was real, and now it seemed imminent. Over time, she had stopped idealizing reunions, mutual apologies, or any romantic renewal. She understood, with a mixture of pain and maturity, that he truly no longer loved her and that he had, in fact, found a new path. However, what still eluded her was how to live with the certainty that her greatest mistake was irreversible, and that the man she had destroyed with her decisions was also the only one who knew her in her essence and chose her anyway. This awareness wouldn't leave her. It was a constant, silent, and at times cruel thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Claire received the invitation to Daniel's farewell party. A mutual friend, someone who worked at the same record label as her and kept in touch with him, sent it to her. He said he knew it might not be the ideal time, but he thought it was important for her to know. It was a small, informal gathering, just for the closest people, at a bar they used to frequent in college. Claire kept the invitation open on her phone for hours. She read and reread it several times, unsure of what to do. Part of her wanted to decline immediately, to spare herself more pain, to avoid another confrontation with reality. But there was another part, one that had been growing stronger since she accepted the end, that told her she had to go. Not for him, not for foolish hopes, but for herself. To look into Daniel's eyes one last time and end that cycle with dignity. Not as the woman who begged for love, but as someone who learned, even if too late, to respect what she destroyed. The bar was full when Claire arrived. The atmosphere was warm, lit with amber hues, and conversations mingled in a welcoming buzz. She entered slowly, without making a fuss. She wore something simple but elegant. Her hair was loose, her eyes steady. She was a different woman. Not the one who begged at the cafe, nor the one who cried alone in front of her old house. Now she had a serene demeanor, the result of sleepless nights, therapy, walks, and the silences she endured. She searched for Daniel among the crowd and saw him in the back, smiling, chatting with some friends. He seemed light, relaxed, like someone ready to start over. Beside him, Isabella was also smiling, her hand resting naturally on his arm. Claire watched the two for a few seconds before approaching. Daniel was the first to see her. The expression on his face was mildly surprised, but not uncomfortable. He nodded politely, and she nodded back. She walked toward him and stopped a few steps away, maintaining her posture. They stared at each other for a long, silent moment. She was the first to speak. Her voice was firm but calm. She said she'd heard about the farewell, that she hadn't expected to be invited, but that she thought it was important to come. She said she didn't want to cause discomfort or bring up bitter memories, but that she needed to end the situation in an adult, respectful manner. Daniel listened attentively, his gaze calm. He replied that he understood. He hadn't expected to see her, but that her presence wasn't a problem. He said he respected her for coming. Isabella gently stepped aside, leaving the two alone for a few moments. Claire took a deep breath. She said she didn't expect to win anything back, that she had no illusions. But that, upon witnessing that moment of farewell, she felt she owed something, not to him, but to herself. That she needed to say, in no uncertain terms, that she now understood. That she now saw clearly the magnitude of the love he offered, and that he destroyed not out of malice, but out of ignorance. That she learned from the pain, and that if anything good could come of it, it was the fact that she would never be the same. Daniel listened attentively, his eyes fixed on hers. And when she finished, he said something Claire would never forget. He said that forgiving wasn't forgetting, but understanding. And that he had understood. He understood her pain, his shortcomings, the silences that had accumulated between them. He said that life hadn't given her another love like it, but a new one. Different. And that he accepted this with gratitude. He hoped she, too, would find something that would make her blossom, not as before, but in a new way. She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She thanked him. And then she said goodbye. Not with kisses, not promises, not that dramatic touch seen in romantic movies. Just with a look. A look of someone who recognizes the other's worth and lets go. She left the bar without looking back. On the sidewalk, she felt the night air touch her face and, for the first time in a long time, felt alive. Not as someone desperately searching for something, but as someone who finally accepts reality and walks with it. In the following days, Claire began writing again. More frequently, with greater dedication. The words flowed like never before. She began publishing texts in digital magazines, until one of them went viral. It was about forgiveness, about starting over, about the courage to accept that not all love is forever, but that all true love leaves roots. She was invited to interviews, podcasts, and events about emotional reconstruction. There, she discovered a new calling, using her pain to help others. And this healed her, little by little. Not that the pain had disappeared. But now it had a place. It had a voice. And it no longer controlled her. Daniel, in the final days before the trip, was packing boxes, organizing documents, and closing accounts. He and Isabella were excited about this new phase. But he also took moments for himself, to reflect, to silently give thanks for what had happened. One morning, as he closed his last suitcase, he found among old papers a photograph from one of Claire's birthdays. She was smiling, hugging him, with a look that at that time still held love. He stared at the image for a few seconds. Then, he put the photo away in a box with other memories. Not as someone who no longer feels anything, but as someone who respects the past and decides to no longer carry it. Meanwhile, Claire, on a quiet afternoon, was walking through a square where she now gave readings to emotional support groups. She saw a young couple laughing on the bench next to her, exchanging knowing glances, sharing an ice cream. She smiled. Not with envy. But with tenderness. She knew how rare that was. She knew how hard it was to maintain. And there, under the late afternoon sun, she understood that, even without a happy ending with Daniel, there was something he had left her, the knowledge that love, when true, doesn't end with separation. It transforms. It teaches. It shapes who you will be later. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most valuable lesson life could offer her. The morning Daniel and Isabella boarded the plane toward the new life they would build together in another country, the sky was clear, and a light breeze gently touched their faces. At the airport, the atmosphere was one of anticipation and excitement. Their bags were already checked, their tickets in hand, and they walked side by side with firm steps, as if the ground ahead were opening up to promising possibilities. Daniel looked at Isabella with genuine affection, with the confidence of someone who finally felt understood and respected. She, with a calm and affectionate smile, seemed to know exactly what he needed, not eternal promises, but true presence, lightness, reciprocity. They didn't say much, but each shared gesture spoke volumes. It was a new chapter being written from everything they had experienced, a continuity that didn't deny the past, but also wasn't tied to it. The love growing between them carried no weight, no demands, just a mature willingness to move forward together, step by step, looking in the same direction. Meanwhile, Claire remained in her city, observing the world's movement with eyes that no longer sought impossible rescues. She had accepted absence as a part of life. More than that, she had understood that certain losses are definitive and, even so, don't have to mean the end of one's own story. Over time, she transformed her pain into words, her guilt into learning, and her loneliness into service. She founded a small emotional listening project for women who had experienced loss, abandonment, and separation. There, she sat with strangers who found in her a mirror and companionship. There was no ready-made advice, no easy answers, just acceptance. She listened, shared, and slowly became a reference for overcoming. It still hurt, of course. There were nights when she woke startled by confusing dreams, intrusive memories, and unnamed longings. But now she knew how to pick herself up the next day, how to make her own coffee without it being a symbol of absence. She lived a new kind of love, love for herself, built with patches, courage, and awareness. Years passed. And one day, while walking through an outdoor book fair, Claire saw a poster with her own name on it. She was the guest author of a collection of stories of inner reconciliation. People approached her to talk to her, ask for autographs, and thank her for the writing that had touched their lives. A gray-haired man commented that her tale of irreparable loss helped him forgive the daughter who had abandoned him. A young woman revealed that, after reading her chronicles, she decided to leave an abusive relationship. Claire listened to it all with teary eyes and a serene smile. It was as if every pain that had once destroyed her now served as a bridge to heal others. She no longer carried guilt. Only memory. And that was what made her so genuine. Across the ocean, Daniel flourished in silence. Life abroad gave him a tranquility he'd never known. He worked in social development, focused on micro-projects with a human impact. He used his experience to guide small businesses, help immigrants reorganize their lives, and teach in forgotten communities. There, he discovered a purpose he'd never imagined. He and Isabella married in an intimate ceremony, unpretentious yet full of meaning. She wore a simple dress, he a navy blue suit. There were no dramatic declarations, just a sincere vow, I'll be here, even when the days are hard. And that was enough. They weren't seeking perfection, just truth. Daniel never mentioned Claire again. Not out of indifference, but out of respect. She was part of his story, yes, but she didn't need to be part of the new. And when someone mentioned the past, he simply smiled, as if he understood that some pain shapes us, but doesn't define us. One rainy afternoon, Claire received a letter from a distant country. She recognized the sender and, with trembling hands, opened the envelope. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from Isabella. The handwriting was firm and direct. The letter was brief, but full of meaning. Isabella was writing to thank him. She said she knew the whole story, that she knew what happened, but that, even so, she deeply respected Claire. She said she recognized the woman she had become, that she read her writings whenever she could, and that, in a way, she was inspired by them. She revealed that, during a difficult time in her relationship, it was a chronicle about courage written by Claire that helped her find her bearings. She ended the letter with a sincere thank you. You lost the man you love, but perhaps you saved many others with your story. Including mine. Claire closed her eyes and cried. Not from pain. But from a rare kind of relief. She had lost the love of her life, but she hadn't lost herself. And somehow, it was all right. Time went on. Daniel and Isabella had a daughter, a girl with intense eyes who inherited her father's calm demeanor and her mother's free-flowing laugh. Claire never remarried. He had a few brief relationships, but none of them deepened. Still, she didn't feel lonely. She was whole. Surrounded by people who admired her courage and authenticity. She lived in a small house, surrounded by books, plants, and welcoming silences. Every now and then, she dreamed of Daniel. Soft dreams, in which they walked together on deserted beaches or shared a glass of wine under the yellow light of an antique lamp. He woke with a knot in his chest, but not with sadness. It was like revisiting a beautiful memory that no longer hurt. He knew that even if it wasn't the ending he'd imagined, it was the ending he needed to have. And that's how the story ends. With him moving on, rebuilt, serene, loved again. With her reborn from guilt, embracing responsibility for her own mistakes and transforming them into paths of healing. There was no romantic reconciliation. But there was forgiveness. There was maturity. There was transformation. Because sometimes, the truly happy ending isn't returning to square one, but accepting that some stories, no matter how intense, need to end for others to begin. And now, tell me, what did you think of this story? What did you feel as you followed this journey full of pain, difficult choices, and real consequences? Leave your comment below, I'd love to hear your opinion. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every week, you'll find impactful stories here that show how much our choices shape the paths of our lives. The profound reflection this story leaves us with is clear and powerful: betrayal is not just a momentary mistake, it is a decision with profound ramifications. It destroys bonds, shakes structures, erases possible futures, and often transforms the most sincere love into a distant and irreversible memory. Even when there is regret, there is not always a return. Because love, to remain alive, requires respect, presence, and truth. And remember, this channel does not condone any kind of cheating. We're here to show, through fiction, the truths of life. That every choice has a price, and that there aren't always second chances. Until the next story.